Hi, so yeah, I'm Ash, and I'm talking to you about hype-driven development. It was a phrase that I heard a while back about people getting really excited about things they hear during conferences or new technology that comes out and just wanted to go ahead and try it. What kind of positive sides this can have and what drawbacks, and basically my experience of trying to do this in a sort of safe environment, making so many mistakes, and mostly just buggering everything up. But you can learn from my mistakes. That's the idea. We're all here. I was thinking of an alternative title for this as like the art of making good decisions, because if you can see me making the wrong decision, then you can make the best decision. That's the theory. So I noticed a growing trend with a lot of my talks, and it's mostly basically, here are all the bad things that you should not do, and I'm going to teach you how to do them anyway. Because, well, here is the procrastinator's guide to doing the wrong thing anyway. So decision-making is fundamental to our process of daily life, from deciding to give a talk, from deciding to attend a talk. Good decisions can lead to successes and personal growth, and poor decisions can lead to you coming to a talk on hype-driven development. But decisions are really, really important, particularly when it comes to a very important production code base. Good decisions when it comes to technologies and tech stack that you're using will often go unthought of and rarely appreciated. You never really notice the successes you have in your project. But your poor decisions, or things that go kind of a little bit ski-whiff, will plague your code base for years, and you'll be indebted with this for a long, long time. So like most platforms, Android has a lot of design decisions at every different level of tech. Obviously, this is from my background as Android, but it's a bit kind of meant to be universal, and quite cool that we have such a strong Google Cloud force here today, because there's going to be a few things on that as well. So some of these comparisons might seem redundant, but these are still questions we're kind of asking. Each one of these options might solve like 90% of the requirements that you have, but then leads to a little bit of redundancy or obsolescence. And due to the fundamental nature, they're kind of difficult to encapsulate. This is especially prevalent in things like dependency injection. So think about maybe if you're using Dagger or Coin or whatever you're using. This tends to creep into every crevice of your code base, and it's so difficult to migrate from one to the other. Quite recently on Android, we saw the deprecation of the Anvil library in favor of Zach Spear's Metro library. And this made some waves because, well, Metro is very fun to use. But it meant that we had to migrate from one DI framework to another. And if you're using DI framework, as you should be in your application, you'll find that moving from one to the other is not an easy thing because it touches every part of your application. So these sorts of decisions are really important. So sometimes we can find ourselves like a bit uneasy about making the decision, knowing that we're going to enter into this kind of contract and this commitment about using this library or technology for the rest of our lives. So it can be easy to fall into the pit of decision paralysis. The problem with decision paralysis is it's the worst decision that you can make. Any decision is bad if it's not made in time. This can mean that you're failing to meet the market, or you're not beating your competitors, or you're just kind of being too slow in getting your solution off the road. So I remember this meme from quite some time ago. One of the things you should consider when making a decision is, what is the cost of doing nothing? Even if you don't actually entertain this as a real option, it's good to kind of use this as a comparison. Like, so what happens if we do nothing? Well, the problem's still there, but we didn't actually make it worse. So it's good to make that comparison against what solutions you do have to choose from. Second option is do something. So most problems obviously require some sort of intervention, but you often run the risk of making things worse. And then with this, you have decision fatigue. If we're constantly bombarded with all these different decisions we have to make throughout the day, then by the end of the day, you might find yourself, oh, what do I want for dinner? Oh, I don't know, just order a pizza. It's these things that kind of take everything out of us. And as a result of this, we as developers tend to have a bias towards the familiarity of the familiar option. So we might choose the familiar tool, the familiar path, which may or may not be appropriate to the problem you're trying to solve. So with this in mind, how can hype-driven development or the development community affect your decision-making? Well, one of the most organic developments comes from feature requirements, wherein the tool is chosen to fit the requirements. Your product manager or your team lead comes to you saying, we need to add this button to our app. Or we need to add this feature to the app. And you think, OK, well, do we have the tools already to do this, to fix this problem? And if not, you evaluate the options you have available. And then you're making a decision appropriately. But sometimes if you're not making the right decision or you're choosing the not best tool for the job, it can result in tech debt in your application, code duplication, repetitions, and these can be red flags and kind of make things a bit more difficult for you in the long run. It's interesting that this phenomenon is not actually limited to engineering. I like to use the phrase CEO-driven development because so many times I'll be sat in the office working away on whatever feature, and the CEO runs in, or the head of tech runs in and is like, we have to have this feature because my daughters thought it was really cool. Like, well, did you get any data from that? It's like, no, but it's going to be cool. So you have to kind of contend with these different things. One of the phrases around this I've heard as well is data-driven development. And data-driven development is using, obviously, data to fuel your development decisions. And there's the quote about this is, if we have data, then let's go with the data. If all we have is opinions, then let's go with mine. Yeah, you'd be surprised to often hear that. But yeah, like I said, we have a bias to choose the most familiar tool, something we're most comfortable with. And this is called the law of the instrument, or the Birmingham screwdriver, if you're from the UK. So this means that we're more likely to use something that we are familiar with, more likely to use like a language like, for example, Kotlin. Might want to use Kotlin for everything, every implementation you can possibly imagine. And this is particularly prevalent in programming languages, as you can see from this wonderful example of human ingenuity. Yeah. Anyway, I thought that'd be funny. So the difference being with these different languages is that Kotlin is like a front-end compilation source, so you're not compiling source to source, you're actually compiling to the target machine code or whatever platform you're targeting. But this also applies to new released libraries, if it's in another project, for example. So one of the biggest influence on these design decisions, and therefore hype-driven design, is conferences. You're all here today learning about new tech, or maybe about tech you already know about, or just learning different perspectives and different things that you've seen. And this is really influential on our decision-making process when it comes to work. So when you see, oh, we have this problem to solve, and then you remember, got back to this conference you just went to, like, oh, I remember somebody talked about this library that solves this problem. Now, you've not tried this in production yet, but maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, maybe everything will blow up. But you always have to evaluate this commercial viability. And most often in community events, you will find, for example, there are responses and people kind of talking about this new product that they're trying to sell. Now, most often, this is fine. If your interests are aligned or your goals are aligned, then this is kind of fine. I use the phrase seemingly benevolent. It's because you're tying yourself to this product eventually, essentially. You've also got other kind of impacts, other influences here. Influences. Things like social media, Twitter, rest in peace. Blue Sky, Reddit, Fediverse. If you're not on the Fediverse, get on the Fediverse. And this sort of appeals to our base human instinct, this argumentum ad novitatum, is that if it's new, then it must be better. If you've seen that scene from How I Met Your Mother, where Barney tries the whiskey in the bar, it's like, if it's new, it must be better. And it's not always true. So sure, it's a new perspective, it's a new kind of take on this problem you might have, and maybe it will save you money, maybe it will save you energy, but not always. So it's important to take these things with a bit of the pinch of salt. So whilst mostly benign, there are a lot of risks with using immature software. You're making a commitment to this tool for better or for worse, and maybe this tool needs a bit of time to mature, to become stable, to survive peer scrutiny. And adventuring in the unknown can be rewarding, but it's important to remember this is the unknown. You're in uncharted territory. You are the first person making these mistakes. You are not able to learn from the mistakes of your peers. So risk management is an essential concept here. How can I use this tool in a way that is safe? Because I'm a keen developer that I want to play around with these new things, but I need to do it in a way that is safe, that is not going to risk the stability of my application or my reputation as an engineer. If you're the one constantly breaking things in your application, your peers will then come to recognize you as the breaker. This is from personal experience. And you will then have to face off a little bit more scrutiny. It's like, hey, Ash, did you really check this library before trying it? No. So it's important to take these risk management approaches. Now, there's a great example I like to use from the Coroutines library in Kotlin, where they use this sort of deprecation mechanism for methods when they produce a new API. You might be familiar with the way Android releases things, and every new release of Android, you have a new set of APIs available, and you have to kind of then wait upon the things. Whereas in Kotlin, you've got a very aggressive development process, and these things are being released kind of quite quickly, and they're being exposed with these kind of documentation that lets you know, hey, here be dragons. Use a bit of precaution. There's another annotation here as well, which is for custom things. So you can create your own custom annotations to give your consumers, if you're producing an SDK, for example, a bit of warning saying like, hey, this is a new thing, use it with caution. But in addition to annotations, there are a lot of different ways of managing your risk. So ideally, code should be disposable. You should build your code in such a way that makes it easy to delete. That's one of the things I kind of try and emphasize about what good code looks like. Good code doesn't follow the practices of Uncle Bob or solid design principles. Good code is code that is easy to delete, because you will need to. And if it's hard to delete, if it's hard to disentangle, to decouple from all the things around it, then you're going to have a hard time. And this is especially prevalent when you're coming to migrating from one library to the next. So, of course, you can use feature-driven time boxes for feature feasibility investigations, coding workshops, isolate the API service, blah, blah, blah. But eventually, you're going to have to kind of do this thing. So some solutions might lead you to question what the problem was in the first place. And just because the tool or the library looks shiny, do I actually have this problem to solve? Do I need to solve this problem, or is it something that applies to somebody else? So you really have to be vigilant and critical of yourself on this, to think, oh, I want to use this feature, but I don't need to. So remember, if you're looking at a solution, what was the problem that is trying to be solved? Of course, this is not relevant to the blockchain, which has neither a solution nor a problem. So stay aware of the scope of your projects. Be aware of the requirements and the behaviors. And it can be easy sometimes to seek out problems that don't exist. And sometimes doing nothing is actually the right course of action. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. One of my former colleagues would always state this acronym, and I never really took it seriously until it started applying to me, which is a human condition. But Yagni, you aren't going to need it, or you ain't going to need it. And this is the idea that you're prematurely building abstractions or prematurely optimizing your code in ways that you're probably not going to benefit from. Maybe that problem is going to come around the corner, but you're spending so much extra time trying to come up with this perfect solution when what you need is something that is good enough, well-designed, highly isolated, and works well in a decoupled kind of way. This former colleague of mine was also very insistent on remaining below the 10 megabyte APK size. This was back in the day when we had to worry about method counts. And yeah, the day he left, the 10 megabyte APK size limit, gone. It was like 19 overnight. So, but I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't already embraced this kind of experimental thing and trying out these new features and talking to you today about using shiny things in production or shiny things where they shouldn't probably be. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do here, is like say my experience of making all these mistakes. So there's obviously this inevitability of software design principles in sometimes where a library is deprecated or removed or just becomes old or bug-prone or no longer maintained, and you have to replace it with something new. Because, of course, new is always better. But that new thing might always not be well-maintained. But the point is that we have this kind of obligation sometimes to choose a new tool if something has become old. So ultimately, the question comes down to risk-benefit analysis, not just a management term. What is right for your team, what is right for everybody on your project, and all the benefits that come with that, and all the costs and everything that come with that. So early adopters are usually progressive, engaged, a bit of a stereotype, but enthusiastic. And that can mean that they're willing to kind of get themselves into problems that maybe you don't really have a way to get out of. But here we are today talking about hype-driven development, and here I am today talking to you about how to get away with it anyway. So we've established that it's generally, probably, maybe not a good idea to follow the hype in production. Such and such comes out with a new library, I've got to adopt it straight away. You've got a stability-sensitive code base, and you've got to make sure that you're not going to be shipping out crashes or instability to your users. But you still want to try out that new fancy library. Well, there's a lot of different ways you can scratch that itch, and you can consider contributing to the open source community. You can create playground projects as a safe sandbox for experimenting. That's my solution, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. But there are countless open source opportunities that you can look into. Say that you have an open source library that does actually have this problem that your shiny new library is a solution for. Then go and check it out. Go and find out if you can contribute, get involved in that project. And maybe that's a project that could benefit from new development. And don't worry about the Cyber Resilience Act. This only comes into account if you're making money. Who needs that? So I'm mostly advocating for a playground project. That's my tool of choice. You can have private projects that are a bit more personal. You can make your own design decisions about this. You can kind of steer the way in which way you want to go. And if you're stuck for ideas about what to do for your personal project, be aware that most applications just list data in some sort of way. Everything is a list of data. So there's always like niche data sets that kind of apply to almost anything. There are tons and tons and tons of public APIs available, even APIs that give you APIs. APIs for fortune cookies, International Space Station data, Chuck Norris jokes, obscure beers. There's always this information available that you can consume and then put into a nice, shiny application for your playground. So this is my playground project. Feel free to check it out. You will find a lot of crashes and a lot of instability. And that's kind of the point. I've been working on shipping version 1 for the last 6 years. I'll get there eventually, I think. I hope. But most of the trouble comes with my obsession with Kotlin multiplatform. I really like multiplatform. I think it's a great tool. And this means that I'm kind of optimizing things for WASMs and Compose for desktop. These introduce a whole variety of different problems that you didn't think you had, which makes it a bit more fun to kind of play with. Wouldn't recommend doing this in production, but it is fun to play with. So my goal, my example, my case study I'm going to show to you today is to show a list of conferences. Now, in the Android world, there's the Android study group. It's a Slack group with a lot of people on there. A lot of people from libraries that you'll have seen if you're working in this sphere. And the idea was that I wanted to show this list from this community-driven built database. Well, not quite a database. It's a Jekyll web page. So I go check out the source and see what's going on there. And I think, how can I use all these different features? So you got things like Compose for desktop, because that's fun. I wanted to have Firebase app check, because I needed to have a secure infrastructure for my one-person application. And multi-platform serialization, data storage, all these kind of nice little fun features that make things more complicated unnecessarily, because I am always able to create new problems. Fun thing with the Firebase app check SDK, there is not a server Kotlin SDK that exists, so I went ahead and made one. So the first goal was to try and use Firebase Firestore to try and pull that data from GitHub. So it's in the form of a Jekyll website on GitHub on the ASG organization. Should be pretty straightforward. The information is there. GitHub has a very comprehensive API. We just need to make that a bit more mobile friendly. No problem, right? Well, no, not quite. So the contents of any kind of GitHub repository, so this managed often by pull requests, the Contents API does not actually give you the contents that are there. It gives you a list of the contents and all the information about that, the meta information, if you will. This is like historical data because, well, essentially GitHub is a Git storage location, so why wouldn't it have this information? But it kind of revealed that for each conference, I would have to then kind of traverse through each one of these URLs, making hundreds of API requests per client. So that was not really feasible to do. Furthermore, each Markdown file contained like a dirty YAML representation of the conference, not a lot of information there. The terminators were not consistent with YAML syntax, so of course I had to write a custom YAML parser. And I was kind of looking into different ways of doing this because, of course, making hundreds of API requests just for a list of conferences is not really a feasible way of doing it. But GitHub has GraphQL. Yay! So I've never actually had the chance to use GraphQL, but I thought this is a wonderful opportunity because now I can start playing around with this client. And I want to put it into a Firebase function, so I have a Google Cloud Firebase function with a GraphQL Kotlin library going into there. So that was fun to work with. But it did give me the data that I needed in the format that I wanted. So this is something I can work with instead of iterating over all these different requests. The return gave us this JSON information we needed, but it's sort of badly formatted. If you've worked with these APIs, you'll know that the data you actually need is nested right far in this kind of tree structure that it's a bit difficult to work with. And the nice thing, the fun thing about Firebase Functions as well is that it is mostly using JavaScript and TypeScript. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, using Firebase Functions means you need to use TypeScript. And me wanting to use Kotlin everywhere, as I mentioned earlier about this language bias, about me wanting to use the tool that I'm most familiar with in this application, means that I want to be able to use Kotlin multiplatform compiled into TypeScript, shipped via Firebase Functions onto a Firebase, so I can run Compose in the cloud with my GraphQL server. Why? Because I like problems. So the first iteration with TypeScript actually was quite nice. TypeScript is not a terrible language to use, and it is very good at traversing through these weird kind of complicated trees. Has all these kind of different types that I wish existed in Kotlin, but here we are. So not satisfied that I had something merely functional, I wanted to take the opportunity for Kotlin multiplatform. Hopefully, I would be able to use the multiplatform code to compile Kotlin code into TypeScript and then ship this into the thing. So Kotlin excels here because it needn't concern itself with the failures of multi-platform UI design. It's only running in the cloud, so there's no worries about having a multi-platform UI that has to be on Android or iOS or whatever platform you're targeting. It's all in the cloud. It's all headless. So with multi-platform code, I will be able to then share the models for network data and function code. And Kotlin for JavaScript allows you to use Node.js libraries. So it's possible to use some of the Firebase admin libraries as well. However, in order to maintain compatibility, Kotlin for JavaScript requires a lot of these dynamic scaffolding things, where this is a dynamic type. It doesn't actually have any types information about it because that's not available from JavaScript. So in the end, we're not actually winning anything from going from using Kotlin with TypeScript because we don't have any type information. So we're just writing TypeScript in Kotlin. Why would I do that? Because I'm insane. So I decided to kind of give up on this kind of Firebase Functions thing and try and check out Google Cloud Functions, because Google Cloud Functions supports using Java instead of only TypeScript and JavaScript. So this actually kind of works. I managed to ship an artifact with this, and it kind of executes, do a lot of weird shadow bundling with Kotlin jars, and it kind of works, except for some library dependencies that were missing and unavailable, la 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 la. But eventually managed to ship this thing, and it was actually working. And this kind of works, but there were some side effects. Environment variables were going missing. The irony of this screenshot actually is this was a failing commit because I used the wrong signing key. But I would later discover that the function was able to use Firebase admin code because it wasn't found on the cloud environment. So whilst Kotlin was capable of loading NPM dependencies, the functions build script wasn't aware of this, so at runtime it would just go ahead and fail. And this is when I discovered that somebody else had tried this already, which was yay. So Andrew Wrights had this approach where he had a Kotlin Google Cloud function where it was compiled to Java and it was shipping all this. So I wasted a good 3 or 4 months before I found this example. So all those lessons learned, don't use TypeScript. But anyway, I wanted to use Compose UI as well with this. So in recent years, there's been some development with Compose UI where you can use Compose without the UI part, because Compose as a runtime is actually just essentially a structure of nodes. You need not use the UI. There's a great library from Square called Molecule, and there's the one from Slack HQ called Circuit. These are really cool libraries as well. I also use them here, not in production because I like sleep. But this is really fun to use. And why would you use Compose in the cloud? Because why not? So naturally, I needed to protect my newly created cloud function and its millions of users by using AppCheck. Because AppCheck doesn't have a multiplatform SDK, I needed to create one. The SDK uses Google Cloud RESTful APIs for compatibility, and well, this ended up with a whole structure of things that became very complicated very quickly, and more than I needed to do. But I did have top-notch security for myself as the only user. This little guy, oh, I'm blocking. Can't see him very well. This is PyPy. So what is even better than a custom GraphQL shipped to a Compose function in the cloud of Firebase to expose this to your user? Well, a 65-line PR against the actual repository that exposes this in JSON format, that I can skip all this altogether. And this was my probably biggest lesson about this, is that I could have skipped all of this if I had just gone upstream and said, like, hey, how about I commit this 65-line PR to expose the data in a way that is friendly for mobile consumers? The owners of the repository were very encouraging, and they're like, this is a great idea, let's do it. And it was merged in a few hours. And I was like, OK, I can delete hundreds and hundreds of lines of code, which was quite satisfying. But it begs the point, make sure you're paying attention to what you have upstream, because maybe you can kind of contribute there. Open source development is always begging for people to contribute, not just file issues or +1 or say that this is a problem. The open source community the backbone of this relies upon developers taking time to kind of fix the bug that they found. So if you can contribute and improve it in some sort of way, then that's fantastic. There's also a kind of side story, which I'm running out of time, actually. I underestimated this, about how I tried to kind of manage this project as well. So I thought it wasn't enough to have my repository with all these kind of shiny things as well. I wanted to have Terraform involved, just because everything has to be structured. So I start learning Terraform. And then I thought, OK, well, I want to have some labels and some kind of automation managed on my repository. So I'm going to manage my repository in Terraform so I can then attribute that. Oh, but I need to have a GitHub application that has elevated permissions. So I create a GitHub application, go through the whole song and dance about creating these extra things. And so eventually, I have this setup where my repository has all the Terraform code for managing itself, so it can manage all the CI, all the checks that needs to happen. But one thing I did not realize about Terraform is its replacement protocol. And that is when you change a property on a kind of repository or resource, for example, and it has authoritative setup, it will delete that thing before recreating it. So then one day, I'm there coding away, like, oh, I'll just add a label to my repository, or I'll add something non-conspicuous, seemingly non-violent, and then git push, repository not found. Oh, it's GitHub down. So I go to GitHub, check, status is fine. No, my Terraform script had deleted my repository. And there was no evidence of this because this was in a GitHub action that I'd run. So the GitHub action was also deleted. So I was like, I can't even check what went wrong or why my code deleted itself. But that's how I managed to delete my own repository. That's how I managed to instruct GitHub to delete its own repository. How did I fix this, you might ask? I called GitHub support and begged for help. Thankfully, they were able to restore the repository. It had some kind of weird linking issues with some various things, but yeah. Be careful if you're managing a repository in Terraform, because it can be deleted, especially if the Terraform code is in that repository. So a bit of a respite, a bit of a relief from all this mayhem. This guy is Kotti, named after Kotlin. My wife and I were asked to, what should we name our cats? I'm like, oh, let's name after our favorite programming languages. I'm an Android developer. She's a data scientist. So we have Kotti and Pi. And Pi. Yeah. So Of course, neither of them can code. They don't earn a living. They just cost money for food. They're cats. So one of the really interesting things about this kind of interesting journey, even though it might not have been successful in the end, is that I'm standing here before you telling about all the fuck-ups that I made. All the things that I did wrong that you can possibly avoid in the future, and how combining all these different things in one is going to be a bit of a tough time or a tough thing to sell. So there are numerous opportunities for knowledge sharing here, like how do you write an attestation server for AppCheck? How can you ship a Git client to a cloud function if you want to try that mechanism? How you can use Gradle composite builds and convention plugins and Mosaic plugin in a multi-platform project. All these different kind of variety of things might make sense in your project, might not, probably not. But it means that you can try out these things and find out in a safe environment, or safe-ish, as long as you don't delete your repository, that this tool is feasible for my real-world use case, or this tool might not be feasible. So you can play around with these things, scratch that open source itch, and kind of work with these things in a safe environment and not bugger up your application for your users. But of course, then that begs the question about work-life balance. How much time should I attribute to spending on my pet projects if I have a family and kids, I have a house maintained, I have 2 cats to look after? And that's totally fine. It's really important to have a good work-life balance. If you can't have the extra time to work on these things, then you shouldn't be expected to do so. Ideally, you should be able to spend your working time on these things. So you can make the argument, I need to contribute to an open source project because we're downstream consumers of this application. So it makes sense for us as a company to give back to the community. A bit of a tough sell when you're talking to managers, but it's a go-to point. You can also kind of time box projects, like, oh, I want to do a feasibility study into this particular tool that we have for this problem, and you say to your product manager or your team lead, I'm going to spend half a day on this and do a feasibility study. That's just me checking to see if it works, and if it doesn't, well, I found out that it doesn't work, and I don't have to worry about wasting more than half a day upon that. But always isolate and build for disposability. So wrapping up from this, it's kind of a reasonable argument to make design decisions based exclusively on opinions. As I said, if all we have is opinions, let's use mine. Don't introduce tools to a project that doesn't need it. This is a really easy thing to do. You'll find lots and lots of projects out there that have all these kind of weird things. And ultimately, every story is useful, even if it's non-productive, even if you break things, even if everything's on fire. In fact, these make the best stories if everything is on fire, because then you can tell people how you fixed it or how you just rage quit and left. So I'm going to close with this quote that I really enjoy, and it's sort of like a bastardized quote from the original, which was then, if Jean-Paul Sartre wrote ANSI code. Everything exists without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. There's the alternative that is every line of code is written without reason, maintained out of weakness, and deleted only by chance. Though it may seem pessimistic, it actually quite well applies to engineering, because be careful of what you introduce. Every code you write has a maintenance cost, and you might just be the one maintaining it. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ashley. Let me ask you, could you have gotten into the Slido and into the Urban Hall room? Everyone's in? If you need if it works with the hashtag DevFest.cz, just please let me know. Otherwise, I'll read you the code. There's like a couple of numbers. Is it coming for anybody?
If you don't have any questions?
Yeah? OK, do we have questions in the audience? Like, do you want to do it the old way? I can just... Anybody wants to ask anything? Cool. This QR code is to give Ashley some feedback, send some love, share some insights about some of your takeaways. And without further ado, thank you. Oh, yes. Love it.
Ooh.
What's your biggest mistake you've made that you learned the most from?
So many to choose from. I once botched a SQL query. This is back in my front-end days when I worked on JavaScript and PHP, but we've all done weird things in college that we're ashamed of. And I was working on a web front-end to a customer database. This is a management order system. And I botched the SQL query and basically just dropped the table. It wasn't like unsanitized input. It was literally just by my bad coding. And I had to then think, like, oh, crap, how can I fix this so the customer doesn't notice? So we had taken regular backups, but the backup was like 12 hours old. So I restored the backup immediately. And I was like, what do I do now? Don't say anything. So I imagine the customer service and that client probably had some difficulties that day, but I didn't. But from that I learned, don't work on production data. Separate your production and sandbox environments. Always double-check your queries. And maybe take a bit more regular backups in case. And have an agreement with your client that if you do fuck up, be honest with them, because that's not a nice thing to do to your client.
Got it. In your experience, which Kotlin multi-platform has been the most challenging to support?
WASM, no doubt. So this project has, for the longest time, been only Compose for desktop and Android. Both platforms have JVM. And Kotlin multi-platform has this fun thing where it knows that the only platforms that you're targeting are JVM, so you'll always have this JVM code. So suddenly you start targeting WASM as well, like, oh, all these things I relied upon heavily don't exist anymore. How do I do file operations? How do I do I/O operations? And depending on which sort of environment you're working in, if you're on WASM, like operating in the cloud or operating headless or operating within a user's browser, these approaches are different. And all these kind of different variances, so JavaScript and WASM probably been the hardest for me on Kotlin multi-platform.
Do you have any recommendation for somebody who wants to embrace more failures in their career and maybe whether they're leading a team or they are a team member, how to get over that pass?
I think ultimately you need to be working in an environment that embraces failure as an option, because, we're all human. We're going to fail, some more than others. And you need to be working in an environment that accepts that sometimes the mistakes are going to happen. And the only important thing is that you learn from it and that you kind of move on in a way that you're not going to make the same mistake again. If you're working in, say, a toxic environment that says, oh, you failed, you should feel bad, then you need to get the hell out of there. You need to make sure you're in an environment that encourages this. Obviously, be sensible. Don't make unnecessary mistakes. Use risk management. Make mistakes in a controlled, isolated environment where you can learn best from it without affecting things in a large way. But yeah, ultimately, be honest with yourself and don't be so hard on yourself. Because I can often be really hard on myself, like, oh my God, I broke all the things. I'm the worst person ever. No, it's OK to make mistakes. Just learn from it.
We can do this last one as well. So Android dev here, new to Comp. Would you recommend Kotlin multi-platform and Compose ecosystem to bootstrapping MVP product for a startup idea? How helpful did you find AI agents to reduce the learning curve?
I'm a little AI averse. I don't like AI, and I don't like the direction it's taking, but that's my opinion. What I will say is KMP introduces a new perspective to Android development. For a long, long time, or as long as I can remember, especially when it came to unit testing in Android, there was always this encouragement to avoid the Android SDK. Because, say, you wanted to run your unit tests on your machine, then you only want to rely on JVM code. If you're relying on context or all these different things from Android world, you then have to kind of spin up a virtual machine or, spin up an emulator and have it running there. So moving on from that, having the idea of purely common code that doesn't rely upon the platform you're targeting, but has those kind of abstractions, gives you a bit of a fresh perspective on what dependencies you have, and a little bit of an appreciation for where you need to set the boundary of your API design. I talk a lot about API design as well, and it's basically just coding for isolation or disposability, making sure that you can delete things if they need to be deleted or replace them if they need to be replaced. So KMP has that kind of a way of giving you a fresh perspective on that. What I will say, however, is if you're building a new startup and you really need to go fast on this, maybe don't worry about it straight away. Think about it and have it in some places, but KMP will be a little bit slower than single platform development, just by its very nature. There's more stuff to do. So I would definitely recommend it over having one for Android, one for iOS. But if you're only targeting a single platform, don't worry too much about it.
Thank you so much there. Ashley is going to be here, so you can ask him in the hallway or throughout the conference. Ashley Davies, thank you for coming and making DevFest an amazing experience. This is for you.
Oh, yay. Thank you.
Ashley Davies, everybody.